Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Alex. And, I was listening to your discussion, and I have some concerns about the way we use the word strongman, because I fear it can sound just too good to too many voters who think, well, isn't the president of the United States supposed to be a strongman? It's a term we've been using for decades in a way that everyone using it collectively understood. I'm not sure it communicates what we would like it to communicate.
You're
here
so
now.
right. We should really call it fascist fanboys, because that's the essence of what's happening here.
I don't have a suggestion. I'm feeling awkward about that term. That's all. That's where I am on it.
Duly noted, and thank you for the feedback. Have a great show.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you. Well, between now and Tuesday, November 5th, the two most important stories we will be covering at this hour are the multiple prosecutions of criminal defendant Donald Trump and the presidential election. There are, of course, obviously, hugely important stories going on at the same time around the world, in Ukraine, in Gaza, and Israel, and elsewhere around the world, in Africa, and Asia, South America. But the presidential election is the most important of all of those stories, because what happens in all of those other stories around the world after November 5th largely depends on who wins the election. If Donald Trump wins the election, the Israeli government and the Israeli military will be free to, as Donald Trump puts it, finish the job in Gaza. Those are Trump's words, finish the job. He means kill as many people as you want to. Donald Trump will not try to achieve a ceasefire the way President Biden has been working to achieve a ceasefire. And in Ukraine, if Donald Trump wins the election, Vladimir Putin will be free to continue to kill Ukrainians in his imperialistic march to take over Ukraine without any resistance at all from the American president. And if Donald Trump is elected president, the story of criminal defendant Trump in effect disappears. Donald Trump would be able to end both federal prosecutions against him by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, who would be instantly fired by Donald Trump, and the two state prosecutions against him in New York and Georgia would be forced into at least a 4-year delay until Donald Trump is no longer president. If Donald Trump wins, then justice loses. If Donald Trump wins, human decency loses. If Donald Trump wins, then all is lost. And as of tonight, most American voters know that. Joe Biden is going to win millions more votes than Donald Trump. But this is the country where you can come in second with the voters and still become president, still win, thanks to the perversion of democracy the founders called the Electoral College. And as of tonight, not enough people in a handful of so-called battleground states who will decide this election understand the stakes of this election. Not enough people in those few states yet understand what they will lose if Donald Trump wins. And so we begin tonight with what is now the most important of those stories that we will be covering this year, because it will determine the outcome of the rest of those stories. We begin with the presidential election. In last night's presidential primaries, Joe Biden was the first to win enough delegates to secure the Democratic nomination for president. Hours later, Donald Trump won enough delegates to secure the Republican nomination for president. And today, President Biden continued his campaigning in battleground states, appearing at the opening of the Biden-Harris Wisconsin Coordinated Campaign Headquarters in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel notes it's the first Milwaukee campaign base for a Democratic presidential nominee in at least 20 years. The Biden-Harris campaign is opening 43 other campaign offices in Wisconsin, all over the state. Here's President Biden speaking at the Wisconsin campaign headquarters in Milwaukee today.
Our freedoms are at stake. They really are at stake, not a joke. The right to choose, the right to be able to determine whether you're going to get to vote, how we vote, It's all in your hands, and you folks like you all across the country, because this is how I won the first time I ever ran. This is how we're going to win again. A lot of you helped me in 2020, and we make sure he was a loser. He is a loser. And we're going to make sure that happens again, right?
At a campaign event in Milwaukee, the president explained what his infrastructure bill means for daily life.
It means wider sidewalks for children walking to school, safer bike lanes for residents and visitors, dedicated bus lanes to get to work faster, new trees to provide shade, and modern infrastructure to prevent sewage from flowing into the Milwaukee River and the Lake Michigan. These are life-changing improvements. They're also going to make it easy for historic black communities in the North and Latino communities in the South to access jobs, school, and entertainment. Opportunities in the city and central hub, from watching the Milwaukee Bucks play to attending Milwaukee Area Technical College. My predecessor talked about infrastructure week for 4 years. He didn't get a single thing done, not one. Ron Johnson, every Republican in Congress, voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, which is helping fund these projects, and he wants to repeal it.
President Biden explained some of what is at stake on the presidential ballot.
Just this week, Donald Trump said cuts to Social Security and Medicare are on the table. Instead of cutting Social Security and Medicare to give tax breaks to the super wealthy, I'm going to protect and strengthen Social Security and Medicare to make the wealthy begin to pay their fair share.
Keep this number in mind. Joe Biden won Georgia by just 11,779 votes in 2020. And on Election Day yesterday in Georgia, Nikki Haley won almost 20,000 votes. All of those voters knew that Nikki Haley had already dropped out of the presidential campaign. But still, yesterday on Election Day, 20,000 voters went to the polls in Georgia to vote in the presidential primary for Nikki Haley against Donald Trump. That is a sign of potential weakness for Donald Trump in November. Nikki Haley's total vote in Georgia was 77,000, which includes early votes cast before Nikki Haley dropped out of the presidential campaign. Today, the Biden-Harris campaign released this statement. Haley's voters continue to make it crystal clear that Donald Trump is not building a coalition that can win in November. Suburban, moderate, and independent voters are rejecting Trump's divisive rhetoric and extreme policies, and it's no surprise Donald Trump is running on the same extreme MAGA agenda that has cost Republicans election after election, threatening democracy, overturning Roe, passing a national abortion ban, repealing the Affordable Care Act, and cutting Medicare and Social Security. Leading off our discussion tonight is Quentin Fulks, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Biden-Harris reelection campaign. He was the winning campaign manager for Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock in Georgia. Thank you very much for joining us tonight from Biden-Harris campaign headquarters in Wilmington. I want to start with what we just identified in Georgia, since you are the highest level expert we can possibly engage on winning the state of Georgia. That 20,000 votes cast on Election Day, on the actual Election Day, for a candidate, Nikki Haley, who the voters know is no longer running for president, where the winning margin in that state last time was just over 11,000 votes. How do you interpret that Haley vote?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again, Lawrence. It's always great to be with you. Look, the vote last night in Georgia bears out exactly what our campaign has been saying this entire Republican primary, is that Donald Trump is failing to consolidate his base and win over swing and independent moderate voters. These voters are protesting Donald Trump and saying to the Republican Party that they won't vote for him because of the extremism, and he continues to double down on it. And our campaign is making sure that we communicate with these voters and letting them know that anybody that cares about Donald Trump's extreme agenda on women's reproductive freedoms, on the Affordable Care Act, on gutting Social Security and Medicare, that they have a home and that they can be involved in this campaign. And so it's, again, a continuation of the story that we have been pointing out for a very long time, that Donald Trump simply does not have the consolidated base to win in a general election.
I want to listen to what Representative Ilhan Omar said yesterday to to those voters who are casting the uncommitted votes in the Democratic presidential primary. Let's listen to this.
Democracy is on the line. We are facing down fascism. And I personally know what my life felt like having Trump as the president of this country. And I know what it felt like for my constituents and for people around this country and around the world. We have to do everything that we can to make sure that does not happen to our country again. The uncommitteds have been very clear. They want a change in policy, and we've seen that. Within 3 days, you had the vice president using the word ceasefire. We now have the president saying there is a red line.
As you know, Congresswoman Omar is talking about a kind of progress that can feel too small and too gradual, especially to relatively new voters who've never really had this issue in mind at presidential on presidential ballots. When she's talking about, well, you know, now we've gotten the Biden administration talking ceasefire, we've got them talking red lines. How do you want to present the case to those voters for voting for Joe Biden over Donald Trump?
Look, there really is no comparison here. And, you know, on one thing, I want to thank, Rep. Omar for her comments, because we know how deeply this issue is and personal this issue is to a lot of voters. And the president has tried to put his administration in a position to go and talk to these voters and listen. Our campaign has tried to talk to these voters and engage these voters and listen. But on the contrast of pointing this out, there is no comparison that the threat that Donald Trump poses to democracy. The president wants the same thing as a lot of these individuals who are casting uncommitted votes. He wants long and lasting peace in the Middle East for both Israel and Gaza. And our campaign is going to continue to communicate that. And a lot of the diplomatic work to get there is done behind the scenes. And that's starkly a difference between President Biden and Donald Trump as well, is that a real leader knows that it takes tact and skill to lead America through a time like this. And that's what President Biden is doing. But then again, there is a litany of things that we can talk about when it comes to why Donald Trump is not prepared to be president of the United States. Look at NATO, saying that we should pull out of NATO and let Putin do whatever he wants to do. He's cuddling up to to dictators and hanging out with them because he wants to be one. He's pledging to gut Social Security, Medicare, ACA, women's reproductive freedoms, bragging about it. There's just no comparison here, but our campaign is not taking any voters for granted, and we're going to put in the work to make sure that everybody knows that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and that they have a place to call home in this campaign.
On Social Security and Medicare, Donald Trump very easily and comfortably said, when asked about cutting them in order to help the deficit issue, Donald Trump said, absolutely, there's a lot you can do. That campaign is kind of running away from that now, saying he doesn't want to do that. He's certainly supported by a party that has historically always wanted to and attempted to cut Social Security and Medicare. There's never been a Republican Congress or a Republican president who wasn't aimed at that.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying the quiet part out loud. And he absolutely meant it, regardless of what his campaign is trying to do to walk it back. And it's time that we strengthen Social Security and Medicare and make sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share, as President Biden is pledging to do. Donald Trump is only in this race for himself. He's in this race to get out of trouble. He's in this race to enact revenge on his political enemies and retribution. He says so himself. He says that he wants to be a dictator on day one. And so we have to continue to point these things out. But it is just reckless. Donald Trump is not concerned about Americans. Donald Trump is concerned about himself. And that's starkly the contrast that our campaign is going to continue to work diligently to make over the next several months.
Biden-Harris Deputy Campaign Manager Quentin Fulks, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you. And joining us now is Ben Wickler, chairman of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. He was with President Biden today. And when Ben Wickler talks Wisconsin, I just listen. Tell me what we need to know about this kind of historic and important Democratic campaign investment in Wisconsin.
So President Biden was in Wisconsin. I think it was his 6th visit today. And Kamala Harris has been here 5 times. We are a constant focus because Wisconsin is the tipping point state. It's the state that tipped for Trump, the presidential election in 2016, for Biden in 2020. 4 of the last 6 presidential campaign margins of victory here came down to less than 1 percentage point. The Biden-Harris administration knows this, and they are investing with their presence, with campaign resources, and ensuring that this presidency and this administration delivers for Wisconsin voters, as they're doing nationwide. So today, President Biden was here announcing a $35 million investment in the 6th Street corridor in Milwaukee to ensure that where an interstate cut through and divided communities decades ago, they're now going to rebuild in a way that brings communities together. And then he came over to the campaign headquarters and basically opened up and connected with dozens of cheering volunteers and supporters, had conversations, took selfies with them. The office that will be the heart of the statewide operation to make sure we both turn out and persuade every possible Biden-Harris voter, every voter who doesn't want a Trump dictatorship starting in 2025. The nerve center for this campaign is in Milwaukee because Republicans have targeted Milwaukee for voter suppression, and they've bragged about it, and we're going to fight back.
Ben, as you know, there is a tension around this campaign. I remember in past presidential campaigns in the pre-Trump era, people would say to me, what's going to happen, as if I knew, and I would always tell them I don't know. And now what I hear from people is, tell me it's going to be okay. Tell me it's going to be okay. It's very different from the feelings that you had on Democrat versus Republican presidential campaigns in the past. It's about, are we going to be okay? Is the country going to be okay? Are we going to get through this? Which means, is Donald Trump going to lose? Is that, what do you say when people ask you that in a state where it's a 1% one way or the other outcome?
I say that Wisconsin over and over, and this is true in all the closest battleground states, it's going to come down to the margin of effort. In other words, the work that people do, volunteers who want to help us, go to wisdems.org. You can sign up to volunteer or to donate anywhere in the country, and people in Wisconsin knocking on doors, making those phone calls, chipping in. That will determine the outcome because it'll come down to 2 or 3 votes per precinct around our state. And the good thing about an incredibly small margin like that is that you can make the difference yourself. Watching this right now, you can play the role in flipping a precinct that helps flip the state that tips the entire electoral college. That is an extraordinary privilege. It's the power of being in a genuine democracy, and it's use it or lose it. This is the moment, if you care about our democracy, to fight for it. And the polls say in Wisconsin, it is tied. This could absolutely come down to a minuscule margin that volunteers, after we win the election and Joe Biden wins another term and we can all exhale, volunteers in this election will be able to look in the mirror and say to themselves, I did this. That's what we want for everyone to feel in this race.
Ben Wickler, thank you very much for giving us that guidance. I know there's a lot of voters out there in states like California, New York, Massachusetts, other places where they are out of the Electoral College game. They're absolutely going to Joe Biden, and they only wish they could help somehow in those states that have that burden and privilege and responsibility in the end of choosing a president. So that guidance is very helpful beyond Wisconsin. Thank you very much.
They can call. They can join our virtual phone banks. Let me just say, we welcome folks from out of state. You'll call strong Democrats and remind them to vote. We don't want out of state volunteers doing the persuasion here, but we can absolutely use all the volunteers anywhere in the country because we had 3.28 million votes in 2020. Who knows how many we'll need this time? We're bringing up the numbers now. We want help from anyone who can help because it's going to be all hands on deck to win this thing.
Ben, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up today, Georgia Judge Scott McAfee dismissed 3 of the 13 charges against Donald Trump on a technicality and invited the district attorney to deliver a new indictment on those same charges that were dismissed, a new indictment that would comply with Georgia's technical requirements. Andrew Weissman and former Georgia District Attorney Gwen Keyes join us next. Today, Fulton County Judge Scott McAfee dismissed 3 of the 13 counts that Donald Trump is facing in District Attorney Fani Willis's election interference case against Trump for his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. One of the counts against Donald Trump that was dismissed involves his phone call urging Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find him the votes that he needed to win in Georgia. In a 9-page ruling today, Judge McAfee said that the counts that he dismissed, quote, contain all the essential elements of the crimes, but fail to allege sufficient detail regarding the nature of their commission, the underlying felony solicited. They do not give the defendants enough information to prepare their defenses intelligently, as the defendants could have violated the constitutions and thus the statute in dozens, if not hundreds, of distinct ways. Joining our discussion now is Gwen Keyes, former district attorney of DeKalb County, Georgia. Also with us, Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. He is the co-author of the new best-selling book, The Trump Indictments, the Historic Charging Documents with Commentary. Gwen, please guide us through this. And have you ever had a dismissal against you as a district attorney in Georgia based on this kind of Georgia technicality? I hate using that phrase technicality when it comes to the law, since it's all technicalities. But it certainly wasn't. The judge wasn't dismissing the charges as unimportant or not really alleging a crime. But it was this very technical thing that I'd love to get your expert reading of.
So first and foremost, I think one of the most important things to remember is that the RICO count number 1, survived, including the specific acts that were alleged to underlie the RICO count, even as it relates to these 6 counts that the judge effectively dismissed. And they all related to the solicitation of violating one of the elected officials' oaths of office, whether it was the Secretary of State, members of the Georgia legislature, or the governor. But what this does, and what a special demur does, is basically say that the indictment did not give the defendants enough detail to know how to prepare their defense. And I think here the key thing for this judge was it was not alleged with sufficient specificity what portions of the Georgia Constitution and the U.S. Constitution might have been violated. Again, every officer, whether it's the Secretary of State, members of the legislature, or the governor, all take an oath. And in that oath, they have to uphold the Georgia Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. And the judge is basically saying that in order to establish the solicitation of violation of an oath of office, the DA should have been more specific. This obviously is not good news for the DA's office. Unfortunately, it is something that happens to even the best prosecutors. But the judge outlined 2 different ways that the DA could proceed, whether to appeal or to re-indict to cure these deficiencies.
Andrew, it turns on the specifics of Georgia law, but it doesn't seem to change the general thrust of the prosecution. There seems to be an available option here to just go forward with what you have, because, for example, the evidence about the phone call to Brad Raffensperger will still be presented as incriminating evidence in the case.
Yeah, it's really worth noting just how small a decision this is. I mean, it sounds like, oh, the judge dismissed cases, but he has a footnote where he basically is like, look, you could obviously go forward, as you said, and just go forward without these counts. You could appeal. Or he says it's really simple to just go back and allege more because it's just more details. And he actually makes an allusion to federal law that says, you know, in the federal system, this would just be dealt with by giving a bill of particulars, meaning all you would do is the government would give more information to the defense. They wouldn't need to actually re-indict with those particulars. And he says this is like a really easy thing to do. So he, in his own words in a footnote, says this is a really small issue. And so the DA has sort of three ways she can proceed. I would suspect, and Gwen's more of an expert at this, but I would suspect I would want to go back and correct this and put in more details, because that way you give a jury a little bit more in terms of options. And it really shouldn't slow the case down, because these are the same allegations, as Gwen has said, that are already in the case and are going to be going forward in the RICO case. So it's a really small decision in many ways. It just reads bigger than it seems.
Gwen, the decision everyone had been waiting for was this judge's decision on whether District Attorney Fani Willis can remain on the case after that hearing on the question of removing her from the case. Are there any clues in the issuance of this decision that are an indicator of how the judge is leaning in the other decision?
So again, it's always difficult to prejudge what a judge may decide, but I think there are several folks out there who see this as sort of a bellwether that the judge is not going to disqualify the district attorney's office. He's outlined very specifically, as Andrew indicated, some of the options she may have to go forward. And so there are several folks that may see this as a win some, lose some week, whereas while the DA may have not gotten the decision she wanted on these motions, the special demurrer motions, that hopefully she'll still be able to retain the case overall and not be disqualified.
Gwen Keyes and Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for engaging in what is so far the single most technical point we have had to get into in the ongoing saga of defendant Trump. And coming up, Donald Trump's favorite federal judge, who he appointed, Aileen Mercedes Cannon, will hold a hearing tomorrow in Florida on a motion to dismiss the charges in that case. That's next. Tomorrow, Donald Trump's favorite judge, Judge Aileen Mercedes Cannon, who was appointed by Donald Trump, will hear arguments from Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's team and Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers over Donald Trump's attempts to have the classified documents case dismissed. The Trump lawyers filed their dismissal requests last month based on the Presidential Records Act and what they call the unconstitutional vagueness in the Espionage Act, saying that the charges are built on, quote, undoubtedly the most confusing and complex of all the federal espionage statutes. Special Prosecutor Jack Smith responded in a series of filings last week, writing, Trump's claims rest on three fundamental errors, all of which reflect his view that, as a former president, the nation's laws and principles of accountability that govern every other citizen do not apply to him. Today, Donald Trump's criminal defense team filed their final reply to Jack Smith, arguing that the National Archives referral of the case was, quote, politically motivated and driven by the Biden administration as a political weapon against Donald Trump. Donald Trump is expected to attend the hearing, which will begin tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. in Fort Pierce, Florida. Joining our discussion now is Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. She is a co-host of the podcast #SistersInLaw and an MSNBC legal analyst. Andrew Weissmann is still with us in our discussion. Joyce, what are you expecting to hear tomorrow?
Well, I think we'll hear exactly what you're talking about, Lawrence, this notion that Trump has of the imperial presidency that lasts not just while he's in office, but afterwards, and would reach these really ridiculous results. For instance, that a president could take the nation's classified secrets and purely through the magical device of saying that they're now his personal papers would be able to walk away from the White House with them without facing any criminal consequences. So that's the caliber of argument that we should be prepared for tomorrow.
And Andrew Weissmann, of course, the most important voice in the room will be Judge Cannon, always on the edge of our seats, wondering what she's going to say, what position she's going to take next.
Yes, so I am going to be listening for reversible error. This is a judge who has shown that she is not terribly experienced at these issues, and she has certainly made rulings that have gotten her into a heap of trouble in a circuit that Joyce knows very well from having practiced there for many, many years. I also am going to be listening for the irony that will be dripping from the fact that you're going to have the former president who had said when he took office that he was going to be beefing up these laws because he took national security and these kinds of documents so seriously. That was in the wake of his having defeated Hillary Clinton and his lambasting her with having held on to these documents at her home and saying, I'm going to really beef these up. But now when the shoe is on the other foot, he's going to be saying, you know what, these are too vague for me to actually be prosecuted under the same statutes that I was touting just a few years ago when I was president.
And Joyce, will we get any indication tomorrow about the progress of the case, how quickly it might move forward from this point?
Yeah, so quickly is not what I'm expecting to hear tomorrow. Judge Cannon is still sitting on a stack of motions that she needs to rule on. You know, I noticed, interestingly, that yesterday there was a docket entry, it's under seal, that suggests that she has ruled on at least some of the issues involving the use of classified information at trial. So there's that piece. But the big issue here, Lawrence, what we're all waiting on is to see whether she will change her trial date. It's currently set for May. No one believes that she's going to trial in May. And so the real issue here is what sort of real estate she wants to occupy on the calendars that will call for scheduling of the various criminal trials.
And Andrew, how does the presidential immunity case before the argument before the Supreme Court affect this case? Because so much of the conduct here is Donald Trump's conduct after he left the presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I have analogized this, his argument on presidential immunity, to a bank robber who is charged with robbing a bank with a gun, saying, well, I can't be charged with that because I legally possessed the gun. His argument is that I was immune and I could take the documents from the White House to Mar-a-Lago. But that's not what he's charged with. He's charged with retaining them and then obstructing justice at Mar-a-Lago. The real issue is the one that Joyce has put her finger on, which is the lollygagging that's going on, and that she can easily just sit on these and eat up time and really never schedule this case for trial before the election, which I really do think is her goal, is how to do that without actually committing reversible error.
And Joyce, it is unusual to read pleadings like this in important cases where literally one side just doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the public should know that that's a very unusual situation.
You know, I think that that's right. I mean, Andrew will tell you this too. There's no absolute right and wrong in these cases. That's why they end up in court. These issues are sophisticated. There are a lot of nuances. There are good arguments to be made on both sides. And what's so striking, especially in these reply briefs that the Trump lawyers filed today, is that there are not good arguments being made. They are really briefs that are based on lots of specious assumptions, things like just alleging that Trump designated all of these classified materials as his personal records without reckoning with the fact that that really can't happen, right? You can't just say, I'm the president, so I'm walking out of here with the nuclear codes. And this is such a really frightening level of argumentation. But as you point out, Lawrence, the real issue here is how will Judge Cannon react? Because she has taken specious arguments in the past that Trump made very seriously. And it was only when they got to the 11th Circuit that she was told, you know, you can't do this. You have to follow the law.
And Andrew, what's the appealability of any decision that the judge might make on dismissal?
So if she dismisses, that is something that the government can appeal. And on immunity, as we've seen, she hasn't scheduled that yet, but that is one that we've seen in the D.C. case can be used to appeal. However, a frivolous immunity argument is one that even if Judge Cannon rules in favor of Donald Trump, if the Court of Appeals says, you know what, this is a frivolous argument, they do not have to stay the case. But just to be clear, that takes time. And, the clock is ticking.
Andrew Weissmann and Joyce Vance, thank you both very much for joining our discussion.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And coming up, when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in the 2020 election and made him a loser, Joe Biden did that with a 24-point lead among young voters. Some of those young voters are now running for office themselves. You'll meet some of them next. This week, the Biden-Harris campaign announced the endorsement of a coalition of 15 youth and Gen Z voter groups. The campaign also launched Students for Biden-Harris that will mobilize volunteers on more than 1,000 college campuses nationwide. In 2020, President Biden carried voters under 30 by 24 points against Donald Trump. And young voters will obviously be a crucial voting bloc again this November. One recent poll found 72% of young voters say they are likely to vote in the 2024 election, with 57% of them saying they are extremely likely to vote. In the last election, young voters helped elect Congressman Maxwell Frost, the youngest member of Congress. Gun safety advocate and Parkland, Florida shooting survivor David Hogg was active in Maxwell Frost's campaign. After that, David Hogg founded an organization to support young candidates for office. David Hogg's organization, Leaders We Deserve, endorses young candidates to achieve more diversity and greater representation in state legislatures, which remain majority male and majority white. Joining us now is David Hogg, president of Leaders We Deserve. With him are two candidates his organization has recently endorsed, Christine Cockley, and she is a candidate for a state house representative in Ohio's 6th district, and Ashwin Ramaswamy. He is a candidate for state senate in Georgia's 48th district. David, let me begin with you and your choice in endorsing these two candidates.
Well, they're incredible representations of all the best that our generation has to offer, from Christine's work across Ohio to help, bring the next generation into power and with the party, and with Ashwin's work to help secure our elections in 2020. And the fact that Ashwin himself is running against a fake elector for Trump in one of the most competitive races in Georgia is significant, because we have to show our generation we're not just voting on the outside, but we're getting representation on the inside too, people who understand the anxiety of what it's like going through a school shooter drill. Because unfortunately, Biden does have a bit of a youth voter problem. And part of our hope with this work is to show young people that there are many people on the ballot, many young people on the ballot that are, not just the president, but are all across the place.
Christine, Ohio can sometimes be a lonely place for a Democrat to be campaigning. What made you decide to run for the state house?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am running to represent the west side of Columbus because I saw Republicans try to take away voting rights and reproductive rights in Ohio last year. This is out of touch with what Ohioans and people in my community really need. The majority of Ohio state legislators don't look like my community and don't have the lived experiences of my community. It's unrealistic to expect people without lived experiences to legislate in the best interest of Ohioans. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck, and I know what it's like to live with a disability. That's why I want to lead with empathy, advocate for our most vulnerable neighbors, and take concrete action at the State House.
And Ashwin, I've had this discussion with David about the need to focus on state legislatures, since so much is happening there, from gun safety issues and other issues that are crucial, and yet especially the national media attention is always on Washington elective office. It's always on the House of Representatives in Washington, United States Senate. What made you aim for the state Senate in Georgia?
Well, what I saw was that I really wanted to give back to my own community. And what we often see is that the way to make larger systemic change is actually not to start at Washington, but to actually start in your own communities and doing the kind of civic engagement needed to do that kind of work. And for me, as David mentioned, I worked in the federal government on election security in 2020, working with states to make sure that our elections are secure. And I saw the important need for more talented folks to go work at the state level. And when I saw that Sean Still, my current state senator, was indicted with Trump for being a fake elector, I realized that someone needed to step up and really show that we're not going to stand for that, and that we actually want folks who are going to be working on the issues that matter and not just overturning the will of the voters.
Christine, what do you think voters need to know about you and what you bring to what you would bring to that office?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to that empathy and being able to advocate for our most vulnerable neighbors. Most importantly, the primary election is on Tuesday. I don't take corporate PAC money, and I rely on small dollar contributions. If anyone wants to learn more about me and help out in sending me to the State House, you can do so at cockleyforohio.com.
And Ashwin, what should voters in Georgia know about you and what you would bring to the job?
What voters should know is that I'm from Johns Creek. It's where I was born and raised. I went to public schools here, and I want to really make sure everyone has the opportunities I did. And I would bring a new perspective to the legislature. I'd be the first Gen Z member of the state Senate, the first computer scientist, and the first Indian American legislator in Georgia. But I hope that by playing this role, I'm able to bridge these communities together. I would be representative for everyone. And I want to make sure that we're really bringing the energy, integrity, and unity to make sure that folks from all stripes can really work together on the issues that matter for us.
David Hogg, how many more candidates are you working with for state legislative office around the country?
This cycle, we're going to be working with 30 across the country. And a big reason for that, Lawrence, is because we want to show that, we can't support every candidate, unfortunately, but the ones that we do, we want to support very heavily. We work on a day-to-day basis with their campaigns, whether it's figuring out how to do their door knocking, whether it's how to do call time, and we also financially support the campaigns as well, because that's where a lot of young people need that support. But the real reason why we do this more than anything, Lawrence, is because I believe the greatest threat to American democracy is the hopelessness and apathy that has created people like Donald Trump. And my hope is that when young people look at candidates like Christine or Ashwin, they know that not all hope is lost. And if anybody wants to support that, they can go to leaderswedeserve.com. Thank you so much.
David Hogg, Christine Cockley, Ashwin Ramaswamy, thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. David Hogg's Leaders We Deserve get tonight's last word.